Hello, Wex YouTube. Thank you for joining us here today. We're here with J Kamara, who we're going to talk to you about his work with photojournalism and then also about his work on photographing protests in a safe and positive light. Hi, Henry.
Hello, how are you?
Good, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well today. Very well.
So to start with, do you want to give us a bit of an introduction to who you are and what your work is about?
Yes, thank you everybody for joining us, first of all. My name is J Kamara. I am 24 years old, soon to be 25, actually tomorrow. So it's my birthday eve. So yeah, I guess I am a Sierra Leonean, British-based photojournalist living in London. I work within the realms of portraiture and photojournalism predominantly, but as Tiffany and I have been discussing, my work sort of goes a bit beyond that in the last recent years. But I think for me, my main sort of goal with photography is to position stereotypes in a new light and allow people to kind of deconstruct these stereotypes and look at things in a different way. So that's why protest photography became such an integral part of my work. And I think, you know, for me, my personal life and the way that I approach my photography is very intermingled, and a lot of the spiritual journeys that I go on in my personal life are reflected in photography. So it's great to have a tool that allows me to do so. And yeah, still working it out, but we're all kind of moving forward with expressing ourselves in our own individual ways, and photography is the way that I found my spin.
Thank you so much. Your work is so interesting. I mean, I've been looking at it a lot over the last couple of weeks, and you do so many different styles of journalism, which is really interesting. So I know you've worked in Sierra Leone, you've worked in Britain on some of the protest works. What are you working on at the moment?
So at the moment, I actually felt very special because I got the opportunity to travel quite recently, which I can imagine for everybody seems like such a far and distant event. But you know, I did actually get to travel back to Sierra Leone, like you mentioned. The work that I do in Sierra Leone is a massive part of the work that forms, you know, what it is that I like to be associated with. I spend 6 months of every year, at least in Sierra Leone, dedicating, you know, my time, my spirit, and my work to uplifting grassroots communities, community interest groups, small businesses, and just stories that I, you know, come across. Maybe taking a keke to go and get some food, I might meet somebody and be super inspired by their stories. So I kind of house this work under the frame of Keeper of the Flame, which is my recognition as somebody of the diaspora that it is of my responsibility to kind of continue that light of Sierra Leone and continue this representation of what it means to be Sierra Leonean. And I was working with a survivor of FGM, female genitalia mutilation. It's very prevalent in Sierra Leone. About 80% of women have actually undergone the practice as part of something that's called the Bondo Society, which is a secret all-women society that happens in Sierra Leone. And I was working with a campaigner and a survivor who uses collective community development to essentially end all harmful practices in Sierra Leone. And of course, female genitalia mutilation being the most prevalent. So I was there documenting her work. We actually got 23 of the cutters to actually give up their ancestral baskets and give up their licenses, their local licenses to cut, which has never happened before in Sierra Leonean history. And we created a ceremony in which they burned these ancestral boxes on a ceremonial fire. So it's going to be my first documentary as a filmmaker as well, which I'm really excited about. I was there doing obviously video and also taking photos. So at the moment, I'm working on curating that work in a way that is actually digestible, because it's not the type of work that you can actually just flick through on Instagram and have a read of. It's quite intense, and it takes a certain amount of consideration to be put across in the right way. So I'm really taking my time to do that. Aside from that, you know, there's a very commercial side of my work as well, which I've learned to kind of understand the balance of, because in order to go to Sierra Leone for 6 months and work unpaid, I've got to make money somehow. And I've really found that to be my give back. And yeah, you know, the other side of my work is sometimes shooting editorials for brands, shooting behind the scenes. I most recently shot Ian Wright, a former football player, for Hypebeast Gillette, which actually came out this morning. And that was one of the first jobs that I did when I came back from Sierra Leone. So I guess, you know, I want to kind of continue being at the forefront of documenting what it means to be Black and British. And I'm very grateful whenever I do get the opportunity from a photo editor who recognizes that that is a direction I'm going in to associate with. To give me those kind of opportunities is really fantastic. And I really feel like I'm really building that representation, which is great. Yeah. And aside from that, I am teaching as well, which is fantastic, a massive part of my work. Out of my studio in Hackney Wick, I've got a dark room and a very DIY way to process film. So yeah, over the last sort of 3 to 4 months, I've been teaching young photographers and also well-established photographers how to process their own film and how to make handprints. So that's been really, really fun. I've met some amazing young talents, and I'm planning to do that a lot more over the next sort of month or so. So yeah, it's been a mix of different things. I think within this current environment, with the pandemic and things sort of starting to ease out, especially within the creative industry, I think things are starting to move now, which is great. But I do think that there was a lot of adaptability that needed to take place within that phase of life for me personally, and I had to kind of really come to terms with the fact that if this was really what I wanted to kind of continue pushing and not just get a job at Tesco and continue to do things on the side. No offense to anybody that works at Tesco, but I think for me, when you're in the arts, you really need to dedicate all of yourself and not have one foot in and one foot out. So I think for me, it was a real period where I had to consider whether that was going to continue to be the case. And I'm very grateful that I was able to be supported by, you know, the great community that I have and all of the people that support my work. And yeah, I'm still here, I'm still going. I think all of us there's an element with all of us that we are kind of just getting by day by week, by month, by year. I by no means at all know exactly what I'm doing. And I think it might look so by just the perception of my work, but I think, you know, I just want to encourage everybody to say that, you know, it's something that we're all kind of understanding and growing within. So there's just no pressure at all, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and your projects sound absolutely incredible. And there's so much variation in what you're doing, I guess, because you have that commercial element and then you have the passion side. I guess my first question to you would be, how did you get into these passion projects, say places like Sierra Leone? How did it start? How did you begin your career in that way, I guess?
Yeah, well, I always explain to people that photography for me isn't a career. It's very much my life, in the sense that when I was growing up, I didn't feel like I had a particular thing that I wanted to do when I was older. So I kind of just went on education, being good at certain things, being not so good at certain things, and then finding out what I did like along the way. And I actually studied English and creative writing at university. So I'm self-taught with photography, and I only took photography between my second and third year of uni. I just bought a camera while I was living in Holland, and yeah, just started shooting, and it kind of just started from there. But within that period of my life, the reason why I took a year out of uni was because I was going through a lot of personal things. I was making a lot of really bad decisions. I was getting involved with wrong people, and I just decided to sell my car and just move to Holland for a year for a fresh start. And that's what I was kind of going through mentally and spiritually at the time. And I was reading a lot of different books. And my mum's sister had passed away, my auntie Howard, and she had lived in Gambia but obviously had lived in Sierra Leone for a period of time with my mum and when they were in their upbringing. And during that time, when my auntie passed away, my mum and I started to have real in-depth conversations about what it was like for her to grow up in Sierra Leone.
Yeah.
And at that time, I was in my third year of uni, so I was about to write my dissertation. And without telling them, I just booked a ticket to Sierra Leone. I just did it. I just went, and that was the first time anybody in my family had gone back by themselves, apart from my dad, since we all went as a family in 2006. So I've got older sisters, and none of them have kind of gone back. So I was the kind of first one to kind of just say that I'm just going to go back. And to anybody who is not just from Africa or from any kind of place, you know, the idea of getting to the Western world, and the Western world full of opportunity and money and jobs and stuff. That's the reason why my parents made the journey from Sierra Leone to the UK. So for me to make the decision to then go back and do the opposite, it wasn't particularly well received at the beginning. Let's just say that. But despite that, I saw value in what it was to be Sierra Leone, and I wanted to really kind of change my understanding of that. And I also felt like I didn't have a great understanding of my parents, and they didn't have a great understanding of me because of our difference in upbringing and experience. So I went to Sierra Leone, and I met an artist called Deval Timothy. He's a multidisciplinary artist, an amazing musician. And Deval is also of diaspora, so he's also Sierra Leonean, but was born in the UK and has a UK passport. And I told Deval about my trip to Sierra Leone, and it just so happened that he happened to be in Sierra Leone the day after I was in Sierra Leone. One of the many coincidences, or how I like to call them, synchronicities that happens along this journey.
Nice.
So Deval and I met when we arrived in Sierra Leone together. And I had a conversation similar to the one I'm having with you, with this question of why are you in Sierra Leone? And I was telling him about my aunt, and I didn't know this at the time, but he was recording the conversation. And 4 or 5 days later, we're in the mountains in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone actually means mountain lion. And
I didn't know that.
yeah. So we were in the mountains in Sierra Leone, and he hands me these headphones, and he says, "Listen to this." And it's this incredible piano score with my words, things I'm saying about Sierra Leone laid on top. And at the end, there's this voice note, or like a field recording of him having a conversation with somebody in the street in Sierra Leone, and they say, "Oh, you're Tusim. You're what we call Tusim." And Tusim is a phrase in Sierra Leone that people call people of dual citizenship or dual nationality because of the two passports. So I have a British passport and a Sierra Leonean passport. And there's a phone in Sierra Leone that a lot of people use that operates on 2 SIM cards, both a Western SIM card and a Sierra Leonean SIM card. So that phrase 2 SIM became something that represented our dual nationality and, you know, our diaspora. And Deval and I went on to support each other with what we were doing in Sierra Leone. We kind of expanded on that. And that was my first experience in Sierra Leone with an artist and just kind of understanding my diaspora. And that experience really allowed me to just come to an understanding of who I was and what it was that made me who I was. And yeah, it was from that interaction that I decided that my own sort of documentation of Sierra Leone would come under the form of Keeper of the Flame.
That's really interesting. It's I like what you said about, I feel like my parents would be the same, where sort of you're going against them, but it's for a good reason. It's to learn about your history and about where you come from. And I think with documentary photography and journalism in particular, where better to start than the place that you come from?
Yeah, exactly.
So then the other side of your photography that you've been doing sort of more recently, I guess, is the protest photography, which is a completely different form of journalism, but is in itself very journalistic and very newsworthy. What was the first protest that you photographed, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, so the first protest I actually photographed was the BLM photo, the Black Lives Matter in London. That was the first one that I actually photographed. And I do want to make it clear, because I'm sure that there are some absolutely fantastic, dedicated protest photographers who are on this call and attend every protest that happens and have probably attended protests far earlier than I did. And I do want to make that clear, because I think for me, protest photography was a very natural thing that happened to me as a result of things that I were feeling and things that I was actually looking at the time everything happened. And for me in particular, the BLM protests and also the protests hosted by Forever Family and all of the various different groups that kind of emerged over that period of time of resistance, I was really inspired by that. And I was really inspired by people kind of coming together. And in my book, Universal Spirit, I really talk a lot about this one sort of unison, this one connecting spirit that we all kind of possess. And what I'm really trying to do within my photography is trying to highlight and find those moments for people to see and recognize and appreciate. So for me, I think, aside from the political side of things, which need no explanation, and why I would feel like that is something that I personally would need to be a part of, I think that was really a catalyst for me. And within the space now with social media, we need to understand that we are extremely busy people nowadays. You got to think, when you're on your phone, you've got access to pretty much anywhere in the world, anything that's happening in the world, you possibly have contact with. And if you compare that to what that would be like if you didn't have a phone or you didn't have a laptop and you only kind of communicated locally, that would have a massively different effect on your psychological feelings, spiritual feelings. All of these types of things really need to be considered. And there's a real responsibility now on making sure that people stand in line with everything that is going on within the world, and it's very difficult to do that. So I think for me, the process was something that I went out naturally and did. And the reason why I think my photographs perhaps maybe stood out a little bit amongst all of the amazing photographs and photographers that documented that period in history is perhaps because I was there not as a photographer, but I was there as a participator first. And one of the things I did sort of realize when I was protesting was that photographers were very noticeable. There are some protest photographers who come out with all their gear on show, and they are there clearly to photograph, which I have absolutely no problem with, because that is your job, and you're doing it for the news perhaps, or it needs to be done. But I think for me, I went in all black. I had my hood on, I went on a bike, and I had a point and shoot in my pocket. So my approach was very different. I went there with the idea that I am protesting, but my documentation of my protesting will come from my eye and my perspective and what I experience. And that's what I did with the BLM protests. And I was really, really taken back by the reaction. I'm really grateful to a lovely woman called Fiona Shields, who's head of photography at The Guardian, who saw the images and asked me to go the following week to document it. And yeah, it was just something that I don't try to overthink my approach to protest photography and let my personal bias influence too much the way that I dictate what I shoot. I try to go there as an observer. Yeah. And it's quite difficult as a photographer to remove one's own personal bias from a situation, but it's really, really important to look at things from a very broad perspective and to try and just actually watch, not just the moments of action and screaming and shouting, but look at the moments when two people are sat on the floor who don't know each other are sharing something with each other, or the moments when people who are not involved in a protest observe the protest and how that makes them feel. There are really many interesting moments which happen. And for me, protesting is one of the most special moments where humans come together in unison. And that was the main thing that really kind of came about after the protest photography. I was really interested in this idea of unison and how resistance brings people together. And life is full of these kind of funny contradictions that, you know, pull and pull against each other, but that's the relationship between the balance of the two. So yeah, I was really grateful with those protest photographs. And again, like I personally didn't want to go out and become famous because of those photographs. I understand that there was a real, of course, there was a real push to make sure that companies and brands were seen to be standing alongside the movement. But I do think that, yeah, I just didn't want to make sure that I wasn't sort of profiting in a way that was untrue to my experience of actually protesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had a question from the audience, which seems like a good time. Could you share with us some of your pictures?
Absolutely, yeah, sure. I will pop a share screen on now.
But yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I think one of the reasons that I was personally drawn to your images was because around the time that we've had several fairly large scale protests, that your images were really positive. And I found that really stood out for me because a lot of the images we saw either had negative connotations or they were very much taken because they wanted a certain look and feel. And for me, your images, they showed a sense of community, and that this feeling of coming together and almost like a strength and a celebration rather than pure documentation. It felt like there was more of a moment or a story.
Absolutely, I think that, yeah, thank you so much, first of all. And it's great that you see that in the work, because honestly, that's what I see when I look at the world, and that's what I'm trying to sort of represent and get across, is just this idea that, you know, as different as we feel, we are very, very similar. And we can also recognize and appreciate these differences, I think. And I think, you know, let me just quickly introduce these images. So these are some pictures that I took of a community interest group called Forever Family. And this was on Reparations Day in Brixton. And I met the team from Lambeth Park, is where we gathered. And we marched from Lambeth Park to Brixton. And for me, it was just an amazing show of human spirit. And I'm the type of person that, like, I love sovereignty. I love people taking things themselves and having the idea to help the community themselves rather than relying on the government or finding excuses as to why things don't happen. And Forever Family Force are actually a fully fledged community-led emergency response group, and also just people that you can go to within the community if you need help, if you have problems, if you feel unsafe, if you need food or shelter. You can go to this community-led group, and that was really special for me. And you know, I think it is our responsibility a lot of the time to do these things ourselves. And I don't want to become dependent. And for me, this day really showed that there is a there is a human spirit which is still very, very, very evident and still very powerful. And I want to be around people who resonate in that same space. And what protests do is it allows you to actually be around those people and feel that energy, and it's undeniable. And any protest photographer or anybody who's even walked past a protest or, you know, witnessed one, uh, will feel the energy, and it's a great way of connecting.
It's interesting because with with something like protest photography, obviously, there's a lot of controversy around how you do it and what you do. But the interesting thing is that if a protest happens and no one takes a picture, then it's all rumours and myths. But as a photographer, you kind of get to decide what the message is that's portrayed to the public about what happened that day and what was achieved and what was going on. And I find that really interesting, that it's sort of all up to you.
Yeah, that is it's an interesting concept, definitely, to contemplate. I think there is an element that is obviously down to the person interpreting these images. But as a photographer, your images take on a space and a realm that is almost beyond your control once you've taken the image. And you kind of have to accept that responsibility, that you're offering your perspective on a moment. And it's not the one truth of a moment, but it is your perspective, and it is what you've seen in that moment and what you've chosen to represent based on your experiences and based on the things that you intake as a being. So I'd like to think that photographers are taking photographs and making photographs for the right reasons. It comes down to intention. And we have to be honest as a society. A lot of the time, sometimes we do things for the wrong intentions. And that is very evident when you see an image which has been taken by somebody who is trying to portray or trying to persuade you to see a situation in a particular way. But that's something that, as a photographer, you can't really escape. There's always going to be a question of what you see in a moment. And the reason why I continue to emphasize that photography is not a career for me, it's interlinked to my life, and it's the way that I show you what I see. And that's the reason why I have to develop my personal spiritual life first, as opposed to trying to become the best photographer. Because if I'm not personally connected to these moments and I don't personally understand what's going on a human level, how do I expect to connect through something as complex as a camera? We really need to kind of get back to the basics of understanding the magic which is happening when you take a photo.
So we have a couple of questions coming in.
Mm-hmm.
So Paul has asked, what's your plan in terms of safety and security? So from a photographer's perspective, I know you said that you sort of went into protest, but you had your camera to shoot too.
Yeah.
Did you sort of have a plan in your head if things escalated, or how you would deal with it? Would you just sort of talk us through your process of what you go through on those days?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, really, really important one. I think observation is really, really key when you're covering protests. You need to be absolutely vigilant to everything that is going on around you. And that could be very difficult, of course, when there are so many different people and so much going on. But it really is something that you need to prioritize, and making sure that you are able to spot the signs of danger, spot the signs of rising tension, and when and how to approach those situations. So, for example, this situation here was a heated discussion between somebody who was a protester and two police officers. And you can see the angle at which I've shot this protects the face of the protester. And also, to an extent, to an extent, protects the faces of the police officers as well.
Yeah.
And I did that because I wanted to show the discussion between a protester and a police officer. It wasn't particularly to show the particular police officer or to show the particular protester. It was to represent the moment. And I think recognizing that that was happening, and if you approach that situation in the wrong way and take a photo in the wrong way, it could have a problem.
Yeah.
So you choose those moments very wisely. And I am very vigilant when I'm doing protest photography. And I think it's really important as a photographer to make sure that you can photograph at a safe distance. You don't want to be too close. So it's always great to have zoom lenses when you're shooting protest photography, because it means that you don't have to get right up in somebody's face to take a picture. You're able to do it at a safe distance. And I think that that's really important. I think another thing is communication is really important when you're photographing protests. You need to be really comfortable in speaking to people that are around you, because you need to be able to eloquently explain to somebody why it is you're doing what you're doing. And if you can't do that in a way that is, I guess, appreciative of other people's experiences, then I think, again, you will find problems in how people react to your photographs, and that will have a lasting effect in the way that your photos look and the way that people feel in your photos. So I think, yeah, the key things are definitely observation and communication, and keeping a safe distance from moments that you feel are unsafe.
I think that's great advice, especially having that distance, because with the technology that's out and the lenses that are out, you really don't need to put yourself right in the middle of a group when you can just adjust the equipment you're using and put some space between you and still get those really nice shots.
Absolutely.
So somebody else has asked, if you do end up in a situation where, as a photographer, you're in the midst of everything, how do you de-escalate it, or when do you know how to walk away from that situation rather than sort of try and get those images?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a really amazing book called Photographs Not Taken, and it's got anecdotes of different photographers speaking about images that they decided not to take. And that's a great way of, I think, approaching that. There are some moments, and it's down to your own sort of spiritual morality, how you feel, and also the heat of the situation. But I do think that as a photographer, in particular, in those moments, it's really important to understand that it is not your responsibility to de-escalate a situation. I think you need to make the decision as a photographer to decide whether you have authority to take something from a moment which is so imperative and so important to somebody else. And you need to ask yourself why you're doing it.
Yeah.
If you're doing it for the reason of helping and emphasizing, continuing to bring a message, then, you might have that 5-second contemplation with yourself in your head. And you might say to yourself, I'm here for the right reason. I know what I'm going to try and do with these images, and I know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And that might allow you to do it. But there are some times where that internal conversation says to you, look, this moment is far too sensitive and can be misinterpreted if the right context is not provided. And what do I have to gain in this situation? Do I feel like I'm taking, or do I feel like I'm making? And that's a real key difference, I think, that I try to include in the way that I approach my photography. If I feel like I'm taking something from a situation, then I'll more than likely choose not to take a photograph. But if I feel like I'm making a situation, or I'm making a photograph in collaboration with a situation or a person or a moment that I feel like is going to benefit other people and help change perspective, then I will use my experience and my moral compass to make the right decision. It might not always be the right decision. I might have taken images which I probably shouldn't have. And there are probably still some images which I wish I took.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, you continue in that journey and you continue to sharpen your moral compass as you continue to expose yourself to more and more challenging moments.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of really great things you said there. So the first thing is that it's not your responsibility to de-escalate. Absolutely. I think obviously as a photographer, you want to go in there and you want to get the shots, but also it's really important to just walk away sometimes. And yeah, like you don't have to de-escalate every situation. It's not your responsibility. I think that's a really good way of looking at it.
Or just observe. Sorry, not to cut you, but you don't have to walk away. You can just observe with your original camera that God gave you, which is your eye. Just observe a moment. Just because you're not taking a photograph and taking something from that moment does not mean that it loses its value.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a question come in actually on that point about journalistic integrity.
Yep.
So obviously when you're taking the pictures, are you trying to tell a narrative that you'll see in your narrative as part of that day? Or do you try and get sort of angles from every side so you can really see sort of the whole journey of everyone's point of view and perspective? How would you describe what you do?
That's a great question. I think I would love to say that I try and show various different perspectives. Like I was saying earlier, and like for example, like this shot that I've just landed on, I've tried to, even though the protest was going on behind me, I've noticed the way that this guy is looking at the protest, and I decided to take that photo to sit alongside all of the protests to contextualize things.
Yeah.
And I think definitely for me, I try to provide more context, because I think if you're only looking at, because I think the idea of protest photography comes inherently with this idea that it is involving a megaphone and sort of shouting and saying what it is you need and want. And I think that that image is sort of what people define as protest. But for me, protest is a much more, and I know I'm speaking very generally. I'm speaking just in terms of image, like image perception. If somebody saw this picture, they wouldn't necessarily say that's a protest image. So I'm speaking in terms of that megaphone image and somebody shouting with their arm up is the protest image in regards to representation. But I think protest photography is more than that. And if you can provide context as to why people are protesting, how people are protesting, what are people's reaction to them protesting, who are the different types of people who are protesting, how did they approach protesting, what was it harmonious, were there any conflicts? I think you need to ask yourself all of these questions when you're approaching a situation, not just protest photography, but whatever situation. You need to actually look at the various sort of vices which are coming together and are at play, which are dictating how a situation might go. So yeah, I definitely think about all of that whilst I'm photographing, because it definitely comes with this idea of observation, I think, and just trying to make sure that you are aware of not just the protesters, but aware of how the protesters are making other people feel, because essentially that is why they're protesting. They're protesting to make sure that other people understand why this is such an important issue. So if you're only focusing on the protesters, sometimes you lose something because you're not actually representing how people are perceiving these protesters.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So what I would ask then is when you put out your images, so when you share them either sort of in a journalistic manner or on your personal channels, not to get too technical, but do you have a narrative that you put with them? Do you allow people to interpret them? I guess it's that interpretation versus intention again. But yeah, just how you put them out. Do you explain what they're about, or do you let them have their own voice in the space they're in?
I think it depends on the space in which I'm sharing. If I was to share a selection of these images within a exhibition, for example, and it was the right environment to have a conversation and a discussion about these images, then I, of course, would provide the context which is necessary. But I think on something like Instagram, for example, it's a much quicker way of communicating, which a lot of people only spend, I don't know what the average is, but it's probably like maybe 3 seconds or 4 seconds on a post. So I don't tend to write particularly long captions anymore. There was a period of time where I used to share very extensive, like I used to write captions in Word and then sort of copy them over into Instagram. Like I used to take them really serious. And I used to explain a lot of stuff and used to really speak from a very personal place as well with my photography. And I guess it was something that I decided to do less of because I wanted to spend some more time actually getting better at photography. I knew I could write, but I wanted to kind of just get more in tune and to start taking photos of the moments that I actually really wanted to, as opposed to having to write 2 paragraphs to explain it. Now, I think I'm approaching the point where I can have a powerful image alongside a powerful chapter or a powerful paragraph, which complements each other and provides the context which is necessary to sort of allow the photo to become a bit deeper.
Yeah. So I guess branching on from that, obviously we've talked about some protests that have really strong principles behind them, but first of all, have you ever photographed a protest that you didn't agree with the cause for? And if you have, how does that make you feel, and how do you go about that? That question's from Amin.
So, very good question. Like I said at the beginning, although I'm particularly grateful for Wex for highlighting my work from the protests, I wouldn't define myself as a protest photographer. So there isn't a protest I have documented which I disagreed with. However, I have documented protests in which there have been opposing sides and views. And I have documented those protests clashing with each other. And within that documentation, there are images of, I guess, a protest which I didn't agree with. But that protest was more of a reaction. So this was a few weeks after the BLM protest started, and this was around the conversation with the statues in London and, statues of Churchill and, whether these statues should be preserved or not. And there was a particular group similar to Forever Family that kind of came about and was self-initiated through social media. And these guys came out to stand in solidarity with the protesters, the BLM protesters who were being accused by people from the EDL groups that were saying that they were going to come down to London and sort of protest against them, and then using this idea of protest in this really sort of divisive way to counter this idea of free speech. Yeah. So I did have to document that, and I'll be completely honest, I did find it difficult because obviously I'm Black and I received name calling and stuff like that, which made it difficult for me to kind of actually just represent these people from a perspective which was, I guess, non-biased. But I tried my best, and I tried my best to just document what was happening. And I think in those moments, you really need to kind of come to terms with this idea of, as a photographer, you're really just a mirror. You're really just holding up a mirror to society. But maybe your mirror, like, to be metaphorical, maybe your mirror is a different shape, or maybe warps society in a different way, which means your reflection of the moment is different to somebody else's, which I think is great. I love the fact that, you know, 200 people can take the picture of the same thing and you'd get 200 different images. I think that that's amazing. I wouldn't have it any other way. But I do recognize that there are certain situations and certain protests, certain circumstances which I, from my experience, am not the best person to document and represent in a fair and non-biased way. And that's where this idea of representation and storytelling, I think, is really significant. It's not about Black stories should only be told by Black people, Latino stories should only be told by Latino people, white stories should only be told by white people. It's not that. It's just recognizing the situation, a story which is trying to be told and represented, and for what intention, and who are the best people to relate and resonate to that moment, to do what is necessary.
Yeah. First of all, I want to say thank you for sharing that with us. And I'm sorry that happened to you and that it continues to happen to so many people today.
Nah, it's cool. You don't need to apologize.
As we've spoken about a lot before this live webinar, we obviously talked about advocacy and how important it is to have each other's backs, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it. We've had a question that's come in that's actually asked something sort of along those lines, which is, can taking photos of these situations, can talking about these situations, especially in journalism, lose you work?
It's a great question. I'm just going to quickly stop sharing my screen.
Yeah.
So yeah, sorry, just repeat the question for me one more time.
So can taking pictures of these situations or getting involved in any journalistic sense lose you other kinds of work, say lose you commercial work? Or
in short, yes, it absolutely can. We live in a very intense social sphere at the moment, where the responsibility to make sure that you are seen to be on the right side of a situation is very, very important. And no doubt, I think my process images perhaps have discouraged certain opportunities. But having said that, I do think that it has also encouraged certain opportunities. So again, it kind of just comes back down to who you want to be as a person first, and what kind of things you value. If you value, you know, a massively paid commercial job from somebody like Burger King, or, you know, comic relief or something like that, and then you do that, that's fine. But, you know, if I have a particular opinion on something that I think is true and right for me, and I don't get an opportunity, then maybe that opportunity wasn't really the right opportunity for me, you know? So that's the way that I try and think about it. And yeah, I'm just grateful for all of the things that kind of happen as opposed to all of the things that don't. But yeah, you know, when you come out and you make a statement on something political, which is often, you know, tied into protests, you're obviously you're gonna have to sort of face the realities and the consequences of having a difference in opinion to somebody else, and that's not a problem. It's fine.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. Is it's up to you as a person what you sort of present. And I'm just going to give everyone a 10-minute warning, so we have about 10 minutes left. It feels like it's just completely flown by.
I know.
We've got a few questions coming from the audience. So I guess one of the questions that seems to be asked in many different ways is, when you're trying to stay safe, and this applies to not just protests, but journalism in general, how do you plan for it? So, you know, do you do research on where you're going? is there anything that you would bring with you? How do you prepare for sort of the unknown, I guess, because it is very unpredictable?
Yeah. Yeah, I've been in some very strange and challenging moments. I'll tell a story. When I was in Sierra Leone, um, the secret women's society is sort of maintained and upheld by this. First, obviously, firstly, this idea of secrecy, but secondly, this idea of mystical magic, black magic. And perhaps this is a bit more far-fetched for some of the people who are listening. Feel free to have your own opinions on this. But I witnessed things and I saw things which were unexplainable and things which I was not prepared for. And I think in those moments, it's really important to have the right team around you and to make sure that whatever your environment you're going into, you're not just completely detached and alienated from the environment that you're in. I think that that is a very scary situation. And that leads me to believe that perhaps you're not the best person to maybe be there documenting. So I think for me, if you're in an environment like that where you face a situation or you come across something which is unsafe or perhaps you didn't prepare for, I think one of the best things that you can do is speak to somebody who is local and speak to somebody who is more familiar with the situation you find yourself in. So I think that again, it's less of a photography tip, but more of a personal tip to make sure that you're able to communicate with the people who are around you to make sure that you sort of feel more safe. I think research is obviously a massive thing. You can never do enough research. You can never do too much research. So I think it's really important to make sure that you go into an environment, especially if you're going with the purpose of documentation. It's really important to understand sort of where the safe zones are, where the spots are that are a little bit more dangerous, where things are notoriously known to be a bit more dangerous for maybe people who are coming through and aren't from the area. So I think you need to know what's happening locally on the ground. You need to make an effort to understand what makes the city move or makes the particular area move in terms of the people, the commerce, you know, what are the right signs, you know, the language, you know, if there are certain things, certain signs where you hear this word, like for example, the word in Sierra Leone for me would be pumwi, which means white boy, because I'm coming from England. People know that I'm coming with like cameras and money and opportunity and stuff like that. So I'm going to be in more danger than somebody who's from Sierra Leone. So if I'm around in an environment and I hear somebody, because they might not know I speak Creole, so they might say, "Oh, look this pumwi, and we can't rob him." That means, "Oh, like look at this white boy who's come to the country. That I'm sure we can rob him." And if I didn't understand, you need to know these things, you need to kind of like make sure they're on the ground and stuff like that. So I think again, this kind of goes towards this like making sure that you are the right person to be in a certain environment and document something. And if you're not, then maybe you haven't done the particular sort of spiritual and personal work to make sure that you are in the position to be in a space. And that comes with connecting with the right people, doing the right research, and waiting for the right time as well.
Yeah. And then I guess leading on from that, obviously we're talking about actual preparation and research, but how do you prepare yourself and I guess recover from a mental health perspective? Because it must be,
Mm.
I mean, I took pictures of a protest a couple of weeks ago and it was one I didn't agree with. And I found that like it took a lot not to be angry on the spot. And I just wonder, like, with all of these things that you photograph, especially in Sierra Leone and with the protests, how do you prepare for it, and then how do you recover from it as well?
Yeah, wow, great question. I could spend a whole hour talking about this. I do think that uh, sort of art therapy and the psychological side of what art is to artists, I think is a conversation that is not had enough. And I think in my future work, I'm going to speak much more openly about it because my personal experience has been it's very difficult. And especially when you're sort of entangling with things that are also relatable to your personal life. So for me, the work in Sierra Leone is obviously very much a part of who I am. And as I'm understanding things about Sierra Leone, I'm understanding things about myself. And I have an amazing girlfriend, an amazing partner who picks me up when I'm feeling super shit and when I'm coming back from Sierra Leone, and I've just come to this recognition that, you know, there's this massive imbalance in the world, and I'm coming back and I'm struggling to kind of reassimilate into what it is to me in the Western world. Um, it's just great to kind of have that support from her as well. And I just think for me, I spend a lot of time trying to detach my personal life as well as much as I can, because like I said, it can be difficult to do so. So sometimes I try to just give my own personal self the space to go for a run, or play football, or just do the things that I actually just enjoy as a person, because I don't want to put myself under the immense stress, or just give myself the pressure that I need to be the one to show people what it is that I need to show them. That can be an unwanted pressure for me sometimes, and I struggle sometimes with putting myself under too much pressure to make sure that I am in certain moments. And I've just given myself the the idea of the art of doing nothing, I guess, because sometimes doing nothing is way more difficult than deciding to do something, and that's what I struggle with. So sometimes I just do nothing, and that's how I deal with it, really.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I think it is really difficult, and it's kind of going back to what you said before. You do have to be the right person, because not everyone can do it. So I'm aware we're running out of time, so we've got one more question.
I'll try and answer it.
Sophie's asked, in the case of your documentary work in Sierra Leone, how are you going to protect the identities if you're working with sort of secret societies and things like that?
Yeah, stay tuned because the film is coming out soon. But yeah, I think the idea of the secret society is not so much around their identity. It's more to do with keeping the practices powerful, and in order to do so, in sort of spiritual and magic terms, is to keep a layer of secrecy around what it is that they do. And I've been asked a lot of questions recently about these seways who are cutters, and they some of these women have been cutting young girls for over 30 years. So people have asked me, how are they going to feel when they give up the cutting? What's the process going to be like? Without going too much into it, the idea of collective community development allows these women to receive small business loans. And then over the 6 months, they receive workshops in soap making and animal farming and rearing. And after the 6 months, if they become advocates themselves of actually giving up the practice and help other seways give up the practice, they actually get an additional business loan. So we've integrated this idea of collective community development and finding alternative ways of income to make sure that these women have a way of looking past these things. And what you've got to understand is that with this idea of secrecy, a lot of these women are victims of the practice themselves. Even the women who are doing the cutters, often it's if you're a mum, and it's very different in Western society, but like imagine if you're living in a village and you've got no way of traveling, you've got no phone or nothing. What your parent tells you to do is what your parent tells you to do. You're just going to do it. It's very hard to think of a way out of that. So yeah, a lot of the women themselves who were forced into cutting and forced into accepting this tradition. So a lot of the people are victims within the situation themselves. So I think it's just about approaching that situation with the sincerity that it needs, to not disassociate and create any further conflicts between girls who are cut and girls who are not cut, and the cutters and the people who are not cutters, etc. It's more about sort of approaching that situation collectively.
Yeah.
But if that person does want to know more, the film will be out very soon. within sort of the next 2 to 3 months. And yeah, I'll be happy to share Keep the Drums, Lose the Knives, which is the community interest group, and J Kamara, who is the survivor and FGM campaigner who I work with.
Thank you so much. We just one last quick one. Sorry, the questions are so good. So Migration Films has asked, what steps do you make to sort of ensure someone's anonymity whilst you're filming? So obviously I know we've talked about what happens afterwards, but how do you get these subjects to work with you? How do you get them to trust you, I guess?
Yeah. Sorry, I missed the first start of the question. Sorry, just repeat the beginning of the question again.
Yeah, of course. So they said, what steps do you take to make sure that someone's anonymity is upheld? So that's like when you speak to them initially, when you get them on board.
Yep. So is that for just photojournalism or protest photography?
Just photojournalism in general.
Okay. I think for me, like I was explaining a little bit with that image of the protester talking to the 2 police officers, I think sometimes the way that I approach my photography in terms of my composition is done in a way where I'm trying to protect somebody's anonymity and their identity within a situation, and sort of trying to preserve that in a way that if it's a situation that makes them is a bit sensitive, then I try to compose it in a way that prevents that. But for me, in terms of, a lot of the work that I do in Catford, I spent 2 years doing a commission on behalf of the Lewisham Council called Humans of Catford, where I photographed people and businesses and spoke to them about the idea of regeneration. That was pretty much done. A lot of the time we would just obviously we would arrange certain meetings throughout the day, but then we just walk around Catford and we just see somebody and we'll just start having a conversation with them. So I think for me, it's very important, again, to be able to communicate, to be able to have a clear understanding as to why you do what you do, and to be sure in your intention so that when you do communicate with somebody, you're able to do that in a way which allows them to understand and feel comfortable. I think that's a massive thing. Which is, it's never easy approaching somebody and asking them to take a photograph. It's never, ever easy. And there are loads of times where somebody's just going to say no, and you just kind of have to just accept that. You just kind of have to awkwardly say, oh, okay, sorry. And you just walk off. Yeah. But, there are some moments that are really special, which, yeah, you have the right conversation with somebody and it's a great connection and they understand what it is, why it is you're doing what you do, and you explain to them why it is that you saw them as a moment to document something and what that's going to do to other people, and why you want to do that. And I think that that's what most people just need to understand, just why. And I think that if you can do that and communicate that in a clear way, I think that more often than not, especially on this side of the world where people are used to cameras and all of that kind of stuff, you're not really going to have a problem with somebody saying no. It's more about if you're in a situation where people don't have camera phones, or a particular group of people have been misrepresented for a long period of time by people who have continued to come and document them from a particular angle, take those images and make money from them, then obviously you have to have a completely different conversation with those types of people. And you need to make sure that you can provide examples. One thing I always do is I have my book, my personal printed book, which contains a preface which I've written about myself, which outlines my photographic sort of intentions and the moralities and the things that I do and I don't do. And also just has examples of my work, various examples of my work, taking pictures of babies all the way up until people who are old and 80 and 90 years old. So just to give somebody that idea and just form a better picture of why I want to take the picture of them.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing with us. We are out of time today, but I think it's clear that we're going to have another talk with you. So much more we could go through. But yeah, thank you so much. It was really informative and really interesting to hear how you work, but also just the vast amount of things that you work on as a photojournalist and as a person documenting the world. So thank you so much for being here. And And thank you to everyone who watched. We've got more events coming up for our Change the Image campaign. You can find those on our events website. And once again, thank you so much, Henry. It was really, really nice to talk to you and hear more about your work.
No, thank you, Tiffany. Thank you again for Wex Photo and all of the various amazing sponsors who are sponsoring Changing the Image. I think it's a really great initiative, and I love sharing. It's also therapy for me to have these conversations sometimes and just sort of come to more of an understanding of where I've come to in my journey. So thank you.
Thank you so much, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us.